The EV market is one of the most exciting growing industries that has taken the world economy by storm in the last few years. While many Western automakers have been taking more reserved approaches when it comes to EV production, other countries and companies are committed fully to complete electrification. Chinese automakers, for example, have taken the world by storm with their expansive fleets of high-quality electric vehicles that come in at extremely competitive prices. To a certain extent, the same could be said about Tesla, but we're still waiting on some of those truly affordable models to come to market. Chinese automakers have become some of the most productive in the world and have turned a lot of heads since they first went onto the scene in a major way. In fact, their rise has been so meteoric that some are worried they could prove to be an existential threat to Western automakers across the board. Today, we're going to break down some of these automakers to see what has given them such a huge advantage, how they compare to Tesla, and how they have gotten to where they are today. With that in mind, let's get into it. In recent decades, the Chinese auto industry has risen up from extremely humble beginnings to becoming a global powerhouse that threatens to upend the entire auto market. Back in the 80s, China recognized a need for a strong local auto industry for their already large and growing population. As such, they invited in Western automakers to operate in China with the stipulation that they would partner with and invest in local automakers as their foothold into the market. Early partners included VW, GM, Toyota, and more, who were happy to share their knowledge in exchange for access to a new and largely untapped market. These partnerships gave the country access to the latest in automotive technology and manufacturing techniques, which gave them the necessary kickstart to start growing. Over the subsequent decades, their auto industry grew substantially and very rapidly. At the tail end of the 1990s, China produced about 2 million vehicles per year. By 2011, they were producing 18 million per year. In those ensuing decades, a number of new Chinese automakers were able to start and flourish as well, serving a large market with a growing appetite for cars. While companies like Geely, BYD, and NIO may not be household names in the West, they have seen meteoric rises that place them among some of the most productive car companies in the entire world. But there's a reason you haven't heard of them in the US. They were able to capitalize on those successes and use them to flip the script on the auto market as a whole and began investing outside of China. One of the most telling moments for the Chinese auto industry came in 2010 when the brand Geely had become so large that they were able to acquire a controlling stake in Volvo. If it wasn't already, it certainly became clear then that Chinese automakers were going to be a major presence on the world stage, even if legacy automakers weren't ready to admit it. Now, just over a decade later, China has grown to become the world's single largest auto market and manufacturer. The country alone produces over half of the world's cars, producing an estimated 40 million out of the nearly 80 million that are made every year. For comparison, the US only produces around 10 million cars per year, only a quarter of the Chinese market. Inside the country, demand for cars sits at around 25 million sales, leaving 15 million available for export to other markets. Once again, for comparison, a good year for US car sales is around 17 million units, many of which are imported cars anyway. There's clearly a huge auto market in China, but competition is also tough and very saturated in that market, so many of them are looking to expand further into foreign markets. For many years, Western automakers were unconcerned by the prospects of Chinese competition, but their recent swings into EV technology have fundamentally changed the game. On the surface, China's EV dominance has seemingly come out of nowhere, but in actuality, it has been a long time coming. At the turn of the millennium, China was on track to eventually become the world's largest importer of oil. While their economy was growing rapidly, this also meant that they were largely dependent on international markets and outside influences. The Chinese government recognized that this could be a problem in the future and began setting the stage for their ongoing path to energy independence via electrification. With that, the government began a concerted national effort to promote increased battery and renewable energy initiatives through a wide array of programs and incentives. China was already home to much of the world's battery production for consumer electronics, so they had a head start when it came to advanced battery technology. They offered cheap loans and leases to manufacturers and gave out plenty of subsidies to companies looking to electrify. Between 2009 and 2022, China gave out an approximate $29 billion to their EV industry, which enabled their extremely rapid expansion. Another added benefit to China's EV success was the manner in which they developed electric vehicle technology. Over here in the West, most automakers have followed Tesla's example when it came to developing EV technology. They started off by making expensive luxury vehicles that enabled them to acquire the resources to expand and make more affordable vehicles. Over in China, a lot of local and regional governments were very invested in electrification from the start and wanted to invest heavily into incorporating the technology on a larger scale. Cities were interested in deploying electric buses and taxis from the get-go, which required huge investments and rapid development to make feasible. One of the world's leading EV makers, BYD, actually got their start in this manner, developing electric buses that are now used across the whole world. This enabled electric vehicles to proliferate very quickly there, as they were being adopted on a wider scale, as opposed to being niche luxury vehicles. It's a luxury that you have when you have that much investment up front. Automakers could then use those skills and that knowledge acquired to pivot into making affordable models for consumers. In the years since these electric vehicles hit the streets, China has used those subsidies as well as other competitive advantages to rapidly improve and develop their EV technology. For one, the government gradually increased the strictness of their subsidy requirements to promote increased efficiency. Much like with the US's EV tax credit programs, companies are incentivized to improve their vehicles in order to continue receiving the subsidies that they have grown accustomed to. Similarly, when foreign automakers have come to set up shop and build EVs in China, they have mandated that these companies use batteries that were made in China to receive their subsidies. For example, despite being an American company, Tesla was actually the second largest recipient of Chinese EV subsidies. Up until 2022, when these subsidies were phased out, Tesla had received $426 million from the Chinese government. Although those particular subsidies ended a few years ago, demand had already been built past the point of no return. Even without subsidies, electric vehicles made up about 50% of all car sales in the country, and it looks like it's only going to continue. Behind the scenes, China has quite a few advantages compared to the rest of the world when it comes to battery production that makes them uniquely suited to thrive in the EV world. As I mentioned earlier, China has a long history of battery manufacturing, but they are also deeply integrated into the world's battery material supply chains. Chinese companies have some of the largest ownership stakes in the mines that produce the rare materials needed for these batteries. From there, they have the biggest role in the actual refinement and production of those materials. These processes are admittedly pretty heavy industries that do have some negative environmental impacts that some other advanced economies aren't willing to accept locally. As such, we have reached a point where China controls upwards of 80% of certain parts of the EV battery supply chain, and large parts of most others. This competitive edge has made them the innovative center for battery development. The current wave of lithium iron phosphate, or LFP battery chemistries, was largely started in China. While LFP batteries have always had certain advantages over other chemistries that were popular in the West, it didn't seem like other automakers would make the switch. Earlier LFP batteries had much lower energy density and were mainly relegated to cheaper vehicles. Newer LFP technology out of China, though, has made huge improvements to density and charging speed, and with those drawbacks greatly diminished, we're seeing these batteries start to appear in a lot of different vehicles. As it stands right now, nearly all LFP battery cells are made in China, but these companies are starting to spread manufacturing out into other countries. In addition to battery manufacturing, these Chinese automakers also tend to be extremely vertically integrated, just like Tesla. Vertical integration is a business strategy wherein a company controls multiple or all of the steps of a product's supply chain. Not only do they make the cars, but they mine the materials, process them, and then use them to make many of the essential components of the vehicle. Controlling more of the supply chain requires big investment up front, but once you have it, it gives you a lot of flexibility, speed, and perhaps most importantly, the ability to save money. VW, for example, is not very vertically integrated and relies a lot on outside vendors to supply parts to their vehicles. VW only produces 35% of the parts in-house for their ID.3 vehicle. Tesla, by comparison, is very vertically integrated, and they produce 68% of the components for Model 3 vehicles made in the US. BYD is extremely vertically integrated as well, and they produce a whopping 75% of the parts internally for their Seal sedan. Additionally, BYD was the only automaker in the world that produced all of their batteries in-house at the time of the onset of 2020, and thus was largely unaffected by the supply chain issues that troubled other automakers around the world. All of these advantages have contributed majorly towards the growth and success of these Chinese automakers in the world stage. Perhaps the biggest thing that has generated all of this hype, though, is the fact that Chinese automakers are making some of the most affordable electric vehicles on the entire market. These brands are producing cars that sell for an equivalent of about $10,000 and don't make significant cuts to quality to hit those numbers. Vertical integration, cheap labor costs, and economies of scale have allowed these companies to produce vehicles at prices that Western automakers are simply unable to compete with right now. That has sent shockwaves through the entire industry, as automakers scramble to figure out how they can stay afloat in this industry. Chinese competitors were underestimated for a long time, and now it's impossible to deny their impact. It would be wrong to talk about the rise of the Chinese EV industry without discussing their biggest name, BYD. It's almost impossible to discuss the state of the EV industry and its future without talking about this company, that until recently most had probably never even heard of. While they have been making vehicles for a while now, this Chinese automaker has grown extremely rapidly over the last few years, and they shook the industry when they overtook Tesla for the first time as the world's largest EV maker for a time. The two companies have passed the title back and forth a few times since then, but as BYD looks to expand further across the globe, it looks like they could continue to outpace all the competition. So what is it about BYD that makes them seem like such a huge threat to the rest of the auto industry? To start, let's look a bit into the history of the company and how their offerings make them so different. BYD's earliest history is actually pretty far removed from car production. The company was started by a chemist in the mid-90s as a manufacturer that produced batteries for consumer electronics like cell phones and the like. That industry proved very successful for them, and in 2003, they used their accumulated capital to purchase a small auto manufacturer to diversify into vehicles. Using their battery-making expertise, and with a huge $230 million investment from Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway, the company made their first plug-in hybrid vehicle in 2008. In the 2010s, they launched their first electric buses, which could travel modest ranges in the city, but was great for moving high volumes of people. As I mentioned earlier, making large battery-powered vehicles like this was an invaluable experience for the company in learning to scale up battery designs and increasing efficiency. After a string of successes with their ICE and PHEV vehicles, the company debuted their proprietary Blade battery system in 2020, which leveraged advanced LFP technology while still offering high energy density in a compact form factor. In fact, we heard recently that part of this technology was developed in tandem with Apple for their future electric car that they ended up canceling. That battery debuted in their popular Han EV sedan and has since gone on to appear in their growing lineup of EVs at many different price points, shapes, and sizes. Tesla even uses the Blade battery in certain Model Ys in certain markets. For many years, Chinese automakers like BYD were brushed aside by the West as less than threatening. Even in 2011, Elon Musk himself had this to say about BYD. Have you seen their car? I don't think it's particularly attractive. The technology is not very strong. And BYD as a company has pretty severe problems in their home turf in China. I think their focus is, and rightly should be, on making sure they don't die in China. It's amusing looking at this comment with the benefit of hindsight, as these two companies are now locked head-to-head in a battle for the top spot of the whole industry. In 2020, when BYD launched the Han, the company sold 130,970 electric vehicles. By the end of 2023, the company had sold 1.57 million units in that year alone. One of the biggest strengths of BYD as a brand is their great diversity in their lineup, many of which come in at very affordable prices compared to comparable vehicles from other brands. Their Han EV is a luxury sedan which competes most directly with vehicles like the Tesla Model S, Audi A6, and BMW i5. The Han isn't as powerful as a car like a Plaid Model S, but for many customers, it more than makes up for it in price. The base Model S starts at $74,990 for a vehicle that can travel up to 402 miles on a charge with a top speed of 130 miles per hour and a 0 to 60 in 3.1 seconds. The Han, by comparison, can travel up to 376 miles NEDC, or about 273 miles EPA. It can hit 0 to 60 in 3.9 seconds, and only costs between an equivalent of $32,800 and $40,000 in China. Drivers will probably see less range than that in the real world, and those prices are admittedly higher in the European markets where this car is sold, but it is still ultimately thousands of dollars cheaper than the competition. While this car definitely isn't as premium overall as something like a Model S, it still has impressive interior quality, decent specs, and a price that is impossible to ignore. Across their entire lineup, BYD continues their trend of offering really compelling EV options for prices that substantially undercut competition. The Tang is their luxury SUV option, which competes most directly with vehicles like the Model X or Y. It has a 7-seat leather interior, 296-mile WLTP range, and a 0 to 60 in 4.9 seconds. That doesn't rise to the same level of performance or range as the Model X, but ultimately it costs about €69,990 compared to €99,990 for the Model X. The Atto 3 is a mid-level SUV which competes most directly with Tesla's best-selling Model Y. The Atto 3 has a lower starting range, rated only for 260 miles WLTP on a charge, or about 236 miles EPA, but in many other ways offers a very comparable level of comfort and functionality to a Model Y. It starts at about €38,000, compared to the Model Y, which starts at €44,990 across most of Europe. One of BYD's most popular vehicles is the Dolphin Compact Hatchback, a product category that Tesla does not currently have a vehicle in, but rumors suggest may be coming soon with a stripped-back Model Y. The Dolphin is specifically designed for budget-conscious consumers, offering between 211 to 265 miles of range, WLTP. For EPA, that'd be a little over 200 or less. It also has a stripped-back design and extreme price flexibility. It starts at €29,990, but even if you add on more of its more luxurious features to its price, it can still compete with most other EV options. This list is already larger than Tesla's entire lineup at the moment, and is only a small portion of BYD's entire range of vehicles. Currently, the Chinese automaker offers 10 models that all start cheaper than the Model 3, Tesla's current most affordable model. According to Bloomberg, the average Tesla sells for $45,000, while the average BYD, on the other hand, sells for less than half, at only $22,400. Those prices are genuinely very low compared to the rest of the EV market, but it really is their lower-end vehicles that have made the most impact. For example, let's take a look at the Seagull. This car, also known as the Dolphin Mini in some markets, is a fully electric compact city car that comes in at an almost unbelievable price in China, between $10,000 to $12,000. The Seagull can travel up to 252 miles on a single charge, or about 183 miles EPA, using a cheaper LFP battery and simplified design to help keep costs down. This definitely is not a luxury car by any means, but even for its price, industry experts have remarked many times that this vehicle is actually very solid. It might not attract the same market as something like a Model 3 or Y, but this car would work perfectly for a lot of people just looking to commute within the city. While this vehicle isn't exceptional in terms of quality or features, it makes up for it in a way that most other automakers cannot currently compete with: price. Over here in the West, automakers have been very slow to bring truly affordable models to market. While many companies have plans to introduce cheaper electric vehicles, they haven't delivered on those promises yet, and they may still be a while out. While Tesla is reportedly working on a few cheaper vehicles, their dedicated affordable EV was shelved in favor of an increased focus on their autonomous robotaxi program, at least for the meantime. While Tesla does hope to majorly push down the average cost per mile of transportation with this vehicle, it will likely be a long time before a car like this could widely replace personal vehicle ownership. While Western automakers have covered the luxury market space, affordable vehicles are few and far between. So with that niche being largely unfilled, BYD saw an opportunity to aggressively push this vehicle not only to China, but throughout the rest of the world too. As well as in China, this car is for sale in both Brazil and Mexico, where it starts at around $20,000. It is expected to come to Europe sometime next year, and its imminent arrival has a lot of Western automakers feeling worried. Most of BYD's vehicles are more expensive when they come to other markets, and the Seagull is no different, but even if it costs significantly more than $10,000, it will still beat almost all of the competition. Even with their own more affordable options on the horizon, few automakers feel like they can realistically compete with these cheap Chinese EVs, at least anytime soon, and they fear that this could be an existential problem for them. Government officials across the West have thus far been very sympathetic to auto industry fears, and have taken many preventative measures focused on protecting domestic companies. Earlier this year, the US government announced a new round of tariffs on Chinese imports, with electric vehicles being particularly singled out. Under previous guidelines, Chinese EVs were subject to an already high 25% tariff, but this most recent legislation raised it up to 100%. There were a ton of other products targeted by these tariffs, but the high degree to which EVs were singled out shows just how much these cheap cars have legacy automakers scared. At the beginning of this year, BYD signaled that they weren't interested in entering the US, but that was mainly due to the complicated nature of the American EV market. The US has been comparatively very slow to adopt EVs, and the ongoing political conflict between the two countries has made the situation very delicate. The recently implemented tariffs have certainly made their imminent arrival to the US less likely, but the company is making some big moves that could ease the path for them in the future. Earlier this year, it was announced that BYD was pursuing plans to build a huge new EV factory in Mexico that could serve as an export hub for the entire region. While the company is probably looking to expand further in Central and South America, some see this factory as a potential gateway for BYD to subvert tariffs and enter the US. In fact, given the current wording of the federal EV tax credit, these cars would be theoretically eligible for a $7,500 discount if their materials were sourced properly. Some experts are considering further tariff rules to stop this, but others argue that it would do little to actually slow down these companies. Given the state of current free trade negotiations in North America, it seems unlikely that Chinese companies will be able to be kept out of the US for long. Some argue that pursuing more strict tariffs will actually have even more negative repercussions than benefits. Experts from CNBC reported that previous rounds of tariffs against China actually led to huge increases in costs of raw materials for American companies. Internationally sourced materials like aluminum and steel saw tariff-related price increases that raised costs upwards of $1 billion for both Ford and GM. It also consequently pushed China to further globalize their industries as a way of subverting trade barriers, leading them to build factories in Europe, Africa, South America, and more. So while these particular tariffs were well-intentioned, in the end they raised prices for American companies and encouraged Chinese companies to grow even further. Tariffs can definitely slow down the arrival of Chinese EVs in the short term, but some experts think that is all that they will ever be able to do, slow them down. The truth of the matter is that as much as these Chinese vehicles scare automakers, the average consumer is a lot less concerned. According to CNBC, approximately 76% of young people in the US would consider buying a Chinese vehicle if they were for sale here. As it stands right now, over 100 Chinese-owned auto companies have a presence in the US, but no company has made the jump to selling vehicles badged with Chinese brands. It is starting to feel like the arrival of Chinese EVs isn't a question of if, but rather when. That has prompted many experts to consider alternative means of controlling the flow of Chinese companies into the US rather than trying to block them completely. Here, the US does have the opportunity to take a page directly from China's playbook in order to actually capitalize on the arrival of these companies. Like I mentioned earlier, when Western automakers were first interested in expanding into China, they were required to first make investments and partnerships with local companies. Those partnerships were mutually beneficial, giving foreign automakers access to a new market, while also not completely disrupting local competition. Domestic automakers have long been shifting their own production to other countries, so building factories and hiring local could be a requirement for Chinese companies to gain access to this market. While these automakers have a lot of room to grow across the globe, the US is still the world's second largest car market and has a lot to offer in terms of pure growth potential. The US faced a similar situation many decades ago with the arrival of Japanese brands like Toyota and Honda, who made smaller and more affordable vehicles than those that were being pushed by the Western automakers at the time. The tide was shifting, and they had to adapt if they wanted to stay competitive. Even with all of these proposed advantages, the question remains whether Western automakers would be able to compete against electric vehicles that are this attractive to consumers. The truth of the matter is that while cars like those made by BYD are competitive in a lot of ways, other car makers like Tesla still have some key advantages that keep people coming back to them. Chinese EVs have great technical features like touchscreens, internet connectivity, and even incorporated AI systems. In the race to stay competitive, automakers are packing their cars full of features that don't always work as well as you might hope or expect. For example, the automated parking systems present in some models is nowhere near as robust as those that we see in Tesla's latest offerings. Tesla has a clear advantage in terms of their self-driving capabilities, and even as companies like BYD pursue partnerships with NVIDIA to bolster their systems, it will take some time for them to catch up. While these Chinese companies do make good offerings in many ways, they're undoubtedly not as high-performing behind the wheel. Making EVs this cheap does mean that certain corners have to be cut in order to remain profitable, and high performance is simply not in the cards for most of these cars. Cars like the Seagull are great for commuters, but anyone that wants something more responsive or simply fun to drive will be drawn towards more premium options. Those same principles apply to the interiors as well as what's under the hood. Many of these Chinese EVs have nice-looking leather interiors, but they aren't designed or constructed with the same fidelity or minute quality as you may expect with higher-end vehicles. Many Chinese EV makers are still quite young as far as car companies go, and they will likely improve as time goes on, but current Western automakers have a legacy and history that has given them a lead in this regard. So a lot of people wonder why Tesla has not been wiped out over in China if they sell cars for a lot more, and it comes down to these things. Tesla is actually seen as one of the premium brands there, and when reviewers compare their cars to Chinese automakers, they do find that they're better to drive, they have better handling, better quality, and more like that. So while Chinese automakers would definitely be able to corner the cheaper end of the market, customers looking for a higher threshold of quality will still likely look towards companies like Tesla for those vehicles. In the end, the threat of Chinese automakers is no longer a distant worry or something that can be kicked down the road any longer. These companies are expanding globally and already making huge dents in the market shares of some of the world's biggest brands. If they want to stay competitive, Western companies and governments are going to have to work hard and stay innovative if they want to stay on top. Whether it's by working with Chinese companies or beating them at their own game by introducing a lineup of truly affordable vehicles, Western companies are going to have to adapt if they have any desire to maintain their position in the market. The real threat of Chinese automakers at this point is the fact that they are producing cars that other companies don't have an answer for. electrification hasn't taken off in the US in the same way that it has in other countries, so automakers here have viewed it as more of an expensive niche vehicle choice. Affordable models are the future of electric vehicles though, and offering them for sale here is going to be the catalyst that drives adoption in the US, like it did in so many other countries around the world. The only question is whether those cars will be made domestically or by any company on the growing list of Chinese automakers. There's a lot in question when it comes to the future of EVs and what Tesla will do to make more affordable EVs, but it seems that on Tesla's side, they actually see a further future where self-driving cars is what we need, and we don't actually need these cheaper, more affordable vehicles. We actually just need robotaxis that drive us anywhere. Regardless, competition is great to see here, and I'm excited to see what affordable EVs will come to market from American automakers. What do you think though? If you had the opportunity to purchase a Chinese-made EV at a significantly lower cost, would you take it? Would you be willing to pay a bit more for an affordable American-made vehicle once those start to make it to market? There are so many factors here to consider, and only time will tell whether automakers will be able to adapt and stay competitive in this changing global landscape. That's all for this video, but in the meantime, if you're interested in the latest Tesla news, you can check out that video linked up here or in the description below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.